Thank you very much indeed, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Parliament Week. What I'm going to do is talk to you about women's political engagement, but I think that my focus is going to be more on the underdeveloped or least developed countries than it is perhaps on the UK procedure, because I imagine that you'll have quite a lot of opportunity during Parliament Week to learn how the UK system works or on occasions doesn't work. Okay, so the importance of women's political engagement is hard, I think, to overstate. This is not because women necessarily have a unique view by virtue of their gender, but because without women, the political conversation is simply incomplete. Democratic systems are at their most legitimate, credible, and effective if there is engagement from all corners of society. It therefore damages democracy if women are excluded. So today I want to talk about women's political engagement in developing countries, as I've said, countries where the exclusion of women from politics is exacerbated by the lack of opportunities that we in this country take for granted in Europe and in the developed world. My purpose is to emphasize the need to support women in developing countries and to recognize the fact that enabling political engagement is not a luxury or something that can be tacked on once a country is sufficiently developed. Political participation is a basic human right, the right to be involved in decisions that affect our lives and livelihoods. Creating the conditions which encourage such participation for women is a crucial driver for achieving development and establishing stable and successful societies. Women's political engagement can't really be seen as an issue on its own. It's something that grows out of the broader context of women's liberation and equality. Therefore, we can't be complacent about the fact that 70% of the world's poorest people are women. Too many women today still live in states of poverty, fear, exploitation, and utter weariness. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has in its preamble the moving phrase, "We the peoples of the United Nations." Note, not we the governments of the United Nations, we the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims, which the UN Declaration goes on to list. The Declaration and the many instruments that followed in the next 60 years also all enumerate the basic freedoms we have a right to: the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and religion, and to political participation. Above all, the international instruments reiterate the universal truth that human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, I'm sure most of you know that, was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1979 and ratified in subsequent years by the overwhelming majority of nations. CEDAW declares that discrimination against women in the political, economic, cultural, civil, or any other field is unlawful. CEDAW also makes it a requirement of ratification that states legislate to provide protection for women and to repeal all existing laws that constitute discrimination. So we've got the international legal framework to end gender imbalance, to outlaw discrimination against women, and to enable women's political leadership to flourish. But that's not the end of the story. Today is not really the time or the place to enter into a long discussion of studies and statistics to demonstrate the state of women's political participation in the developing world. However, I will briefly run through one set of statistics, if only to illustrate the nature and extent of the problem. In those countries that the UN classifies as least developed, the number of women parliamentarians is lower than the global average. This is despite the fact that the majority of these countries have quotas for women parliamentarians. In the least developed countries, without such quotas, the average is only 12% of women parliamentarians compared to 18% globally. So we can agree, I think, that political empowerment of women is a laudable aim and a non-negotiable right, but the question is, how should it be achieved? I've already said that a great many of the world's women live in poverty, fear, and exploitation. Though political participation is undoubtedly their right, it is perhaps unrealistic to expect such women to aspire to political leadership when their primary concern remains subsistence and survival. Therefore, the conditions for political equality have first to be created. In an ideal world, girls go to school, learn employment skills, resulting as often as not in later marriages, better family spacing, and fewer children. They take up dignified and rewarding work and ultimately become politically engaged at the local, regional, and even national levels. Once enfranchised, some become democratic representatives themselves. It is at this stage that women's empowerment becomes transformative in bringing about permanent shifts in the distribution of social power. But this trajectory for women from educational and economic equality to political leadership is by no means automatic. Inherent conflicts of interest can and do arise. For example, children may be disadvantaged if their mothers break away from oppressive family contexts in order to assert their right to education or economic independence. Minorities may suffer additional discrimination, and communities as a whole can become destabilized. We shouldn't also forget the pervasive and corrosive culture of misogyny that remains in many cultures. Not only does this keep education and economic empowerment out of reach, it also makes prejudice and violence against women socially acceptable. So, full political participation is built upon educational and economic equality. In my experience, educational and economic equality are key to raising women out of a state of poverty and subsistence. In other words, they are development issues. We must therefore consider how best to support development as part of how to support women's political engagement. Research indicates that successful development in these areas depends on at least two principles. First, successful development focuses on what people actually need, not what we say, or what we, donor organisations, governments, politicians, etc. would wish to give them, but what they actually need. Secondly, initiatives that strengthen what already exists in the community, even in embryonic form, are more likely to be sustained. The rationale is that an innovation that is conceived and that grows organically within the community will allow leaders to emerge, locally acceptable mechanisms for monitoring and accountability to develop, and people to have a voice and a sense of ownership of the innovations that occur in their communities. This in turn will mean that any given project will more likely to be nurtured and defended if necessary. Existing structures within the community will be more likely to adapt, if not pressured to do so from the outside. People in the less developed parts of the world know very well what will improve their lives. Our job is to trust them by providing resources. We know, for example, that providing education is vital to development. But a school on its own is not going to be transformative unless all the underlying fears and traditional beliefs can also be dealt with. The community needs to discuss, explain, and accept change in order to have a sense of ownership. Once development is entwined with existing structures, cultural, social, and other obstacles can begin to be chipped away, worked around, or watered down in a way that can never be the case when these principles are ignored. So by following these principles, programs to provide women's education and economic development have a higher likelihood of meeting their own objectives, becoming sustainable, and eventually institutionalized. I'd like to give you a couple of examples of these principles at work. One in the arena of women's education, which arises from my pre-Lord Speaker days. As Lord Speaker, I'm not meant to have any views or do anything even remotely political. So anything that I've done in this sphere has been done in my pre-Lord Speaker days. And the other example is about economic empowerment, which came from just a few months ago, a visit a few months ago. The issue of girls' education is one I'm absolutely committed to. In early 2002, on a post-Taliban visit to Afghanistan, a country with which I'd been associated for over 30 years, I came across a young man recently returned as a refugee from Pakistan, whose dream was to set up a school for girls. He'd begun in a tiny bombed-out building in the extreme west of Kabul. He had 30 pupils ranging in age from 7 to 35, attending in 3 daily shifts. To cut a long story short, I began to support him in very small ways to begin with, and gradually over the years the school developed into what it is today, Marifat High School. It teaches nearly 3,000 pupils, both boys and girls, a full curriculum of liberal arts, sciences and vocational training. Students go on to win international scholarships to overseas universities, and some return to teach at the school. They become part of the new educated generation, and some will be the future leaders of Afghanistan. The reason why this project has succeeded beyond our expectations is that it already existed, and it is rooted in the community. Even then, much work had to take place to reassure parents who had lived through the brutality of the Taliban regime that their daughters were safe to attend school. The Parent Teachers Association was a powerful force in developing the school and enabled parents and the local community to be involved at all times in decisions that affected them and their children. The sense of ownership by the community means that the school will be defended against any potential threats. And indeed, a few years ago there was a threat from one of the madrasas nearby who objected to girls being educated, but the school is about 50% girls. And indeed the community did literally, with fisticuffs and sticks, defend the school. My second example, earlier this year I visited Pakistan as part of a CPA, Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, UK branch delegation. While there, we met with the Women's Parliamentary Caucus for almost 3 days of highly intensive discussions. This significant group of women, parliamentarians from both the National Assembly and the Senate, have been successful not only in enforcing through gender-balanced legislation, but also in striking out discriminatory statutes. One area they've concentrated on is promoting microfinance services to women. A number of indigenous organisations are involved, ranging from foundations and think tanks to grassroots skills training programmes. A large amount of money is available for microfinance schemes, which, we were told, achieve a 98% success rate in terms of payback. One example is the Cash Foundation, this appropriately named. This is a homegrown organisation with the goals of alleviating poverty, especially amongst women. It has the explicit aim of enhancing their economic role and decision-making capacity, even at the most local village level. The foundation is supported by third parties, but within 8 years of its creation, it became financially sustainable and self-reliant. At the risk of too great a simplification, I would suggest that there are several ingredients in the Pakistan example which bear further scrutiny. First, there are approximately 100 women parliamentarians who are members of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus in Pakistan. They are from all parties and have been successful in persuading male parliamentarians to support their efforts, resulting in highly sympathetic legislation. There is political will based on a strong lead from the female, she's now the former Speaker of the National Assembly, but she was a very powerful figure, and her work is being continued by the new Speaker. They are an example of women's political activity becoming institutionalized and thereby helping other women towards political participation. So these are just 2 examples from my experience, but I know that work in these areas is tried and tested. The developed world has a long history of funding education, setting up schools, and improving access to finance. Unfortunately, there remain cultural and systemic obstacles to success in many developing countries. Mindsets need changing. Government support needs to be clear. Parents need reassuring. So even if every eventuality has been thought through, large programs can and do fail, due, for example, to lack of local government engagement or simply the nervousness or distrust of the community. So what we need is a process where each step underpins the next. Girls' education can help to enable women's economic activity. Successfully creating the conditions for women's education and economic empowerment will often involve encouraging progressive, even radical social and cultural changes. The combination of these factors will result in countries with a better educated population and more citizens becoming valuable economic actors. Such countries are societies where women's political leadership is both culturally and practically possible. This is admittedly a long-term process. It may take some generations and it may suffer setbacks. It is understandable, therefore, that people opt for strategies like reserving a number of seats in a parliament for women, as is the case, for example, in both Afghanistan and in Rwanda, or having a set number of women simply appointed to a parliamentary body, as in Saudi Arabia. However, these can only be short-term steps. Women's political empowerment can only flourish if its roots are deeply embedded in a culture of women's educational and economic equality. Political empowerment is far less likely to be the result of it is simply as a result of quotas. In fact, arguably, such arrangements, by providing a quicker route to political involvement for some women, might undermine progress towards political engagement for all women. Thank you.